So our next speaker is Dr. Paul Johstono, and I have to read his very long title because he is really someone very special to have within our Seleukid caucus. He's Associate Professor of Military and Strategic Studies at the Air Command and Staff College in Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. And there he has been, I think you've ceased to be the director of leadership and the profession of arms, right? So so it's a very rare opportunity to have amongst us ancient historians or classical scholars interested also in ancient military, someone who is teaching modern day soldiers or officers, in fact. And that brings with it some very specific perspectives, which I noticed and a lot I could learn from Paul when I was co-editing the latest volumes, The Seleukids at War. And his military interest is reflected especially in his monograph publication, The Army of the Ptolemaic Egypt, from 323 to 204, which was published in 2020. Since we are already a little behind time, Paul, I pass on this laptop to you, and with this also the floor. Just move it. Oh, you need the. Okay, does it?
No, this is great.
This is great for you?
Yeah, yep. Okay, so it is a delight to be here and participate alongside a bunch of Seleukid scholars, since this was not the area that I focused on initially, and so it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to this conversation, and thanks to the hosts. So in part one of this study, which was published with in the Seleukid Papers, Volume 2, Perspectives, Volume 2, I examined Seleukid recruitment into military service and field armies through the lens of force generation, a modern concept that breaks the process of fielding forces into 7 categories of analysis: forces, requirements, resources, demands, readiness, risk, and time. Forces concerns the personnel. This isn't moving. There we go. Concerns the personnel and categories into which they fit: citizens, settlers, mercenaries, professionals, and so on. Requirements are the sorts of roles the state anticipates for its personnel: phalangites, medium or light infantry, specialists, engineers, so on. Resources describes the human, material, and financial capital available. This includes Macedonians, manufacturing capacity, breeding grounds for horses, and so on. Demands are similar to requirements, but anticipate the missions the operating environment is likely to entail, which could range from pitched battles to sieges, to irregular warfare and skirmishes, and so on. Readiness describes the process of making sure fielded forces are properly trained, organized, and equipped, which might be near constant readiness in the case of standing armies, all the way down to wholesale organizing, training, and equipping after conscription or mobilization in the case of raw units. Risk assesses vulnerability to contingency, like economic instability in times of war mobilization, under or over specialization in troop types, or critical materiel held vulnerable in vulnerable or hard to reach places. Finally, time is a critical variable that moderates across all of the other factors. When time is a luxury, we tend to find a lot of flexibility in institutional structures. When time is not a luxury, states have to manage their requirements, resources, and readiness carefully to ensure they can meet demands on short notice. So most studies of the Seleukids Trying to get a slide. Most of the Seleukid army have started from the fielded forces in pitched battles and worked backward. There are a number of fairly good accounts of the Seleukid army in ancient sources, to the point that tables of their various contingents litter practically every book on the subject. To evaluate force generation, the previous work started from the local, wherever such information was available, and worked up to the forces fielded for military campaigns and in the Seleukids' great battles. Much of the literature on the Seleukid military has emphasized its extensive and highly efficient mobilization of a limited martial population, either through straightforward connections between possessing allotments of land and military service obligation in particular units, or in the case of some scholars, a large standing army. More recently, a number of studies have explored ways that the connection between military service and land may have been mediated by associations. My study found that in force generation, the Seleukid forces were considerably more varied than the grand studies often appreciate. While the grand narratives generally speak of the Macedonian-style phalanx, the silver shields, and interesting national contingents from parts of the empire, in the source level, from this inductive approach, we see katoikoi settlers, hippithroi, encamped troops, hired xenoi alongside mistopheroi. We see national contingents and a phalanx detached from the field army in the deal between Smyrna, Magnesia, and Seleucus II. In Molon's revolt, we see thyreophoroi, Thracitai, and other line troops, but no phalanx. While in Antiochus III's army that suppressed the revolt, the phalanx was guarded on its flanks by standing contingents and foreign mercenaries, with lower readiness contingents held in reserve as an epitegmata, a kind of brigade of different regional troops. In Babylonian documents, we see garrisons of standing troops, guard troops in citadels, and a militia. And all of that is before the installation of politai in the reign of Antiochus IV. In Antioch, there was not one, but several overlapping mechanisms for recruitment, including allotments, but also rosters by household and city block, and indications that perhaps half or more of the Antiochian citizens held privileged military roles, particularly in the cavalry, but presumably in the silver shields as well, and that held those roles in numbers beyond what the Seleukid army truly needed or wished to field. As a result, some Antiochian citizens also found service as officers or as mercenaries or in special detachments across the empire if they found military service or it found them at all. Finally, the study suggested three main conclusions. It looks like five there, but first, the Seleukids formed their core units like the phalanx by conscripting them from local pools out of complex institutions, and then organized and equipped the desired number of them for service in the phalanx after mobilization. Second, that the complexity and inefficiency of local institutions bespoke deficiencies in centralized strategy, as well as the multitude of roles beyond field service and royal armies that local military institutions served. And then finally, this linkage between the size of Seleukid armies and essentially a critique of maximal mobilization, that the Seleukid field army size was controlled much more by logistics and command capacity than the actual size of the manpower pool. What I'm trying to develop now is a follow-on discussion that looks at reconstitution of the Seleukid military in the period after its encounter with Rome. And so here again, I'm trotting out 20th and 21st century military concepts as to craft an approach, a methodological scheme for how to think about what's happening in the Seleukid military in the era after Magnesia and the Treaty of Apamea. So reconstitution is an extraordinary action, it's not regular action, to restore combat effectiveness for a military unit or entire military. It arises from a situation where military forces are inadequate. for mission requirements or for operational demands. This is usually because of losses or because of changes in the environment that demand changes in how the unit or military is organized, trained, or equipped. This could be technology, it could be population. There are a lot of reasons this can happen. It may arise from a situation where resources are inadequate or misaligned to sustain the military. While historians are more inclined to use the language of reform to talk about military change, reconstitution encompasses a broader concept for talking about how militaries respond to combat losses, to defeat, and to environmental change. It may include replenishing manpower or material, may also reorganize military forces, rearm them, retrain them, or make efforts to restore cohesion and esprit de corps. So in 190, an army of Romans with their allies, as we all know, inflicted a serious defeat in the pitched Battle of Magnesia. The battle hinged upon a disaster with scythed chariots on one wing and lost its glimmer of hope for the Seleukid side when Antiochus III and his assaulting forces on the opposite wing proved unable to rout the Romans opposite them. Then the Seleukid Macedonian-style phalanx succumbed to a standoff attack from Roman and allied troops who refused to assault the phalanx, but instead encircled most of it and shot it full of missile weapons until the phalangites and the elephants among them routed. The subsequent Treaty of Apamea permitted the Seleucids to pull their equipment out of Asia Minor, but they had to sacrifice most of their recruitment base from that region and pay a large indemnity. This was not the end of such developments for the Seleucids. In 168 BC, just after Aemilius Paulus's decisive victory at Pydna, a line in the sand and a verbal threat from Senator Popilius Linus was enough to halt the Seleucid siege of Alexandria and spur Antiochus's retreat from Egypt. In the following era, the Seleucids continued to confront both instability and hostility on the perimeters of their kingdom and endured numerous succession crises and civil wars, the combination of which eventually doomed the kingdom. Now, as I get into my progression through several of these categories, and I won't cover them all for sake of time, I just want to be clear that in using modern technology, a force reconstitution to structure the analysis, I am not suggesting that the Seleucid military had their own reconstitution philosophy or even a particularly conscious or consistent strategy for how reconstitution happened. While I suspect some elements of conscious planning at several points, this review is intended as an organizational schema. It would suffice even if all of the Seleukid actions were simply intuitive or reflexive responses. And in fact, I suspect that some were. All right, so I'm not following them in the normal structure for how we talk about these in military doctrine, but in order that I think made more sense for me, just as I organized this. So I begin with the evaluation of the demands, what demands were anticipated after their defeat in the war with Rome. The Treaty of Apamea assured there would be less naval action and attempted unsuccessfully to end the Seleukid use of war elephants. There's a second episode of this in the 160s BC that also becomes important for that process of ending those parts of Seleukid military action. But in a sense, those changes contributed positively to the resources at Seleukid disposal, as naval operations and elephant corps were particularly resource intensive. The lesson of Magnesia was perhaps foremost to dump the corps of scythed chariots, which were disastrously inadequate in combat with Pergamene and Roman forces. The next likely lesson of Magnesia was that a successful Seleukid army could anticipate fighting Roman armies again and should prepare appropriately. Besides those things, the demand would stay largely the same for forces that could conduct major state wars with sieges and field battles, but also pacification operations, suppressing banditry and insurgent movements, as well as guarding borders and patrolling cities. With the demise of the Macedonian state in 168 and the defeat of the Ptolemies by Antiochus, the demand for large Macedonian-style phalanxes was declining. Whether the Seleucids recognized this or cared may be another matter. The Roman war was a blow to both root and bud of the Macedonian phalanx. The ancient accounts of Livy and Appian claim the Seleucid army lost more than 60,000 slain in the war with Rome's two largest battles, without even counting losses in naval engagements and other actions. While the numbers are probably exaggerated, I consider not even including the word probably there. The 16,000 men in the phalanx were unlikely to escape and would have left a significant demographic impact felt in places like Antioch. In addition, the Treaty of Apamea handed over the military settlements in Asia Minor outside Cilicia to Attalid control. From 189 to 174, the Seleucids were paying a heavy war indemnity, and in the same period were also seemingly permitting much of the revenue of Coele-Syria to go to the Ptolemies as the dowry of Cleopatra I, at least until her death in 173. Two significant shifts took place in Seleukid reconstitution of resources. First, a bit counterintuitively, at the same time the Seleucids were finally free from both the indemnity and letting the Ptolemies collect revenues in Coele-Syria, Seleukid silver tetradrachms declined in weight, slightly but noticeably increasing coins in circulation. Seleukid tetradrachms remained mostly at that standard until the end of the period I'm examining here, then began to decline more significantly after. At the same time, and for the next several decades, with a few interruptions, Seleukid bronze minting increased in volume in the distribution of higher value bronze, and is usually reckoned to have doubled its nominal value, where the former calcus became a dicalcus, and so on. Both efforts would provide marginal gains in Seleukid resources, including for soldier pay. Of course, the Seleucids also brought back to Syria windfalls of plunder from Egypt, Coele-Syria, and often with less successful results, several Elamite temples. The second and most significant shift had to do with manpower. At Antioch, Antiochus III completed the third quarter of the city and peopled it with Greeks most associated with mercenary and allied forces in the Roman war, Aetolians, Cretans, and Euboeans. Antiochus IV added the final quarter to the city, the Epiphaneia. If we follow Libanius, its inhabitants came significantly from the Syrian villages located near the Hellenistic settlement, all of which had developed their own lores, establishing their ancestral Greekness. By these additions, and despite the casualties at Magnesia, the city's citizenry was again robust already by the time of the Daphne procession in 166. Beyond the addition of populations and quarters at Antioch, this era is significant for Antiochus IV's innovative approach to Hellenistic settlement. Some of the foundations rubber-stamped Hellenized status and granted polis privileges to whole towns. This is mostly in Syria and Cilicia. Other foundations, like those at Babylon and Jerusalem, granted extended privileges to colonies inside of settlements, but not to the entire populace. The community of the Antioches at Jerusalem is the most famous example. In the tradition of Second Maccabees 4, it was a Jewish embassy that petitioned for the polity, which included a register of the citizens, a gymnasium, and an ephebia. It was not an implanted colony of Greco-Macedonians or military veterans, but a Hellenic community with martial tones for Hellenized or Hellenizing Judeans. The next most famous, deservedly more famous foundation was at Babylon and made about the same time. Innovative polities appeared elsewhere at Tarsus, Ptolemais, Gaza, Gerasa, Daulicae, and in many other places. Many of these establishments had come into existence already when, according to Maccabees, Antiochus IV called for everyone in the empire to be one people, a statement viewed with caution and sometimes outright skepticism. The rhetoric, in my opinion, both lagged and outpaced reality. Antiochus may have encouraged these developments out of a Hellenizing cultural or political project, not a military one, but the effect was to increase this conscription pool of gymnasium-trained, Greek-speaking, register-listed people inside of the empire. It worked effectively in Babylon, at least, where despite a handful of conflicts between the Politai and their neighbors, they provided significant bodies of troops on multiple occasions, first under the Seleucids and then again under the Parthians. When it comes to forces, the Seleucids continued to field armies of mercenaries, allies, standing troops, guard units, settlers, and so on. There are three shifts that are evident in the period and worth considering: an increased use of internal conscription into standing service, the creation of the Roman-style legion and renewed phalanx contingents, and attempts to significantly increase the standing portion of the army. As for existing institutions, the evidence from Seleukid territory is sparse, but it may be possible to make some inferences from Cleopatra I's policies in Egypt after the death of Ptolemy V. Under her guardianship for Ptolemy VI, the Ptolemaic settler system grew significantly. For a state that had increased its non-settled, serving or standing component under Ptolemy V, and would do so again under his sons, the administration of Cleopatra went the opposite direction. During her tenure, we have evidence for a restructuring of the Macedonian phalanx settler system into three new categories. In addition, the first evidence for the allocation of former infantry allotments to mounted police, and the allocation of allotments to a large number of settlers born in Asia who had fled or moved in some sense to Egypt during and after the Fifth Syrian War. And then finally, the allocation of land for 4,000 veterans of the war in the Thebaid, and to a category of cavalry called the cousins of the Katoikoi Hippes. This is inadequate evidence for the policies of her contemporary Seleukid rulers, Seleucus IV and Antiochus IV, but it at least gives some indication of the dynasty's convictions about military settlement. Of the three shifts in force structure I've mentioned, the first is internal conscription. In Greek, the standard term for hiring mercenaries is xenologeo. There are plentiful examples of this hiring action taking place in the Hellenistic era, but it's nearly always by going abroad. Yet two instances from the decades immediately after Magnesia describe mercenary hiring in Syria. The earlier instance is unfortunately fragmentary. The famous minister Heliodorus came to Laodicea during a round of mercenary hiring, and the Epicurean Philonides convinced him to spare the city the more extreme effects of conscription. This can really only mean that Heliodorus was raising mercenaries, by which we usually mean foreign troops hired for pay, not under specific obligations, that he was doing it inside of the Seleucus, which suggests something even perhaps more like press ganging. It is very possible that this was irregular. He may have been raising troops to support his bid against Antiochus IV. Yet just over a decade later, we find Lysias doing the same thing between campaigns into Judea. The second shift is the 5,000 strong contingent armed in the Roman manner. 5,000 men in the prime of life at Daphne accords with the selection of elite units in the Antigonid kingdom, which selected its peltasts or silver shields on grounds of age, household wealth, and inspection. The Antigonid kingdom, The Seleukid army had already fielded Thuriaphoroi and Thracatai, Hellenistic panoplies similar to Roman equipment. The Ptolemaic army had picked Thracatai, an elite unit of their own larger set of Thracatai in the early 2nd century. Beyond Polybius's specific mention of chainmail armor, his in the Roman manner may also refer to the division of companies into subunits under centurions to imitate the Romans' flexibility gained by passing initiative to lower levels of command. The Ptolemies were fielding their own units organized in imitation of the Roman fashion no later than 163 BCE, but probably before 168. Even Judas Maccabeus' reform of the Judean troops into commanders of hundreds and fifties prior to his battles with Lysias could reflect adoption of this same organizational scheme. The description of the battle at Beth Zechariah describes phalanxes of armed troops holding the center with the actual phalangites on the wings, which would indicate a more dramatic shift in the Seleukid concept of employment and nomenclature. The main points of evidence scholars have previously used for a Seleukid standing army come from this period I'm discussing. In 145 BCE, Demetrius II unexpectedly found himself with unchallenged rule. Ptolemy VI defeated Alexander Ballas at the Battle of the Onopteros, after which Ptolemy died from his wounds and Alexander was murdered in flight. After pushing the Ptolemies out of Syria as well, Demetrius dismissed his armies, each to his own place, except his foreign mercenaries, whom he kept for his own security. In Josephus' account, he added that the discharge of the armies was a particular shock because of the disruption in pay, for the kings before him had continued to pay their soldiers even in times of peace. This comment has been cited by Griffith, Apergis, and others in support of a large-scale standing army throughout Seleukid history. Taylor remarked instead on the difference between part-time civic troops and professional mercenaries, and Demetrius's action was normal even if the soldiers reacted with dissatisfaction. Mittag agreed with Taylor, identifying them as the Seleukid Katoikoi, and believed Demetrius dismissed them because so many had served on the opposite side in the civil wars. Josephus' statement that the soldiers were paid annually and in peacetime points to a different conclusion. First Maccabees speaks as well about the army at Daphne, recording that Antiochus IV, gathering that force together, opened the coffers, paid them for annual service, and told them to be at readiness. The most natural reading is that this was perhaps just a one-time action in preparation for a future campaign. But in light of subsequent and comparative evidence, I suggest the author of Maccabees may have mistaken a reform that moved much of the Seleukid army toward active service, functionally treating the core of the army more like mercenary forces rather than mobilized citizens and settlers. The clear implication across Josephus and First Maccabees is that standing service had become a more significant proportion of the army under Demetrius's predecessors. And Demetrius II, when victorious, had gained control of military forces that had been in standing service across multiple rulers. Demetrius II was attempting to return to old norms of service and mobilization, but by then a new norm had taken shape for 2 decades. The effort backfired. We'll just skip from there to the conclusion for sake of time. All right, so I set out to examine 3 traditions. The new polities. I don't know that I believe that the different political foundations of Antiochus IV were tied necessarily to fourth generation problems, but it at least exchanged, it provided a larger base for conscription, but perhaps weaker ties in terms of actual direct obligations to serve in royal armies. As far as the standing army, I could go into this more, but I think the evidence for this tradition, which competes with the Bar Kokhba thesis on the Seleukid army, really comes from this Reconstitution era, and I'm not sure how far through the army it extended or how long this lasted. And then Romanization. There's good evidence for the decentering of the phalanx. It's particularly interesting that the last time the phalanx is mentioned in Seleukid service, it is under Apollonius, also called Theos, who is an Idumean commanding a regional force. And so the last example of phalangites, I suppose, in the Seleukid army is under a regional commander with a dual name. But as far as what the spread of Romanization means, there's a chance it just means the proliferation of Theriaphoroi. And in that sense, it is at least complementary to these larger gymnasium-trained populations. And then finally, in terms of evaluating the whole thing, there are a number of doubtful indicators. The reconstituted army continues to be defeated in major campaigns, and may have been a contributing factor to the repeated civil wars and subsequent heavy casualties and lost territories that force new rounds of reconstitution until the end of the dynasty. And then finally, the reconstitution efforts that may have helped lead to the near conquest of Egypt, still lead to Antiochus IV balking at the prospect of fighting the Romans again in the 160s BC. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I wonder who would like to go on first. I see Ben. Yes, please. Ben, can you please unmute yourself?
I'm sorry. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. That was clear as a bell, and I got a lot from it. I always get a lot from you, but especially today. And I think I heard something I've been waiting to hear for a few years, because I'm always asking the question sort of how forced was forced generation. And usually I'm told, oh, it wasn't forced at all. Everybody wanted to go into the army. That was the way you made it in the world. Who wouldn't want to go into the Seleukid army? And I've always doubted that.
Yeah.
At least, it's always, I'm not generalizing. It's a sometimes thing. So what I heard from you, I think, is, well, there was mercenary hiring, but sometimes it didn't go that well. And so they had to press. They had to, I can't remember the phrase used about gangs, horse gang, press gangs, something like that. And so I guess I'm also asking, do you have any examples of resistance to being conscripted? I know I'm superimposing modern things about draft dodging and things like that. I know that I'm aware of what I'm doing, but especially after the kind of defeats that you're talking about, and I love that term reconstitution and everything like that, did that make it harder? I mean, do we have any examples of, no, I don't want to go, or anything like that?
So the thing that I think is most relevant here, we don't have examples on that level necessarily, but if you look at the cities of the Seleucids, especially Laodicea and Seleucia Pieria, they both establish agreements of autonomy and freedom in the 2nd century, and to some degree they're playing off would-be kings against one another to get some of these grants of inviolability and things like that. That probably didn't prevent mercenary recruitment out of those cities, but it does seem like an effort was made to diminish some of the obligatory elements of recruitment for those cities, and that they sought out grants that would have given them a little bit more independence.
That's very helpful, because I was only thinking about individuals. You're saying there were cities that preemptively were trying to prevent their people from necessarily being conscripted.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great.
I have a question.
Yes, please, Pim.
Yeah, you can hear it.
Would you come over so that the
Yeah,
others,
sure.
or we repeat it?
So thank you very much. It was very, very clear presentation. I'm wondering about the naval tradition within the Seleukid Empire, and you touched upon it a little bit.
Yeah.
I know that there are not a lot of sources, especially for the 2nd century BC.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how maritime force generation would work.
Well, so we have the cases of what's the little Sidonian descended community on the coastline of I can't remember. There's the inscription from, I think it's the time of the time of Antiochus IV that talks about their heritage of service in the Seleucid Navy, which can't go back more than a generation because they were under Ptolemaic rule before then. Exactly. But there's at least some reason to think of that as being a kind of a family tradition in certain Phoenician and Cilician regions. And I've wondered, so one of the things that actually you're the perfect person to talk about this with, is the use of larger denomination bronze coinage as a possible supplement to military pay. Mm-hmm. We always talk about the drachma a day approach, but as John Ma pointed out, when you have a closed system for recruitment, you can sometimes offer lower wages because you can still outcompete the local market. And we see military themes on some of this bronze coinage, and I think it's Antiochus VII, who spends a lot of time operating in Phoenicia and builds a power base there for some time, has a number of bronze issues.
True. Yeah.
With naval paraphernalia.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that might be related to some of the efforts to regenerate naval forces in that region.
Yeah.
One of the big issues in 163 BC when a Laodicean assassinates a Roman senator is over the intended destruction of polyremes.
Exactly.
And so exactly what the Seleucids were doing in terms of naval forces is hard to say, but it's as best I can think of, I think it's those connections with those coastal communities.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of Seleukid efforts to play nicely with them. And I think that's because they recognize that either their present or their future prospects in naval power depend on places like Tyre and Sidon and Ptolemais.
Yeah, you already included some very nice images of bronze coins with a Macedonian shield or a helmet.
Yeah.
There's also, of course, the coins like you mentioned with maritime symbols on them. And there have been some theories about the occasion of these symbols.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to check out those images. When do they include weapons? And then compare them to your chronology and your analysis.
Yeah.
If there's a connection there.
Yeah. Well, so some of the Macedonian shields, they're from the 5th Syrian War context. And then the ones on the bronzes with naval iconography, I believe are from the period of Antiochus VII's attempts to consolidate power in Phoenicia and Coele-Syria. And so I think that fits. And then kind of in the same vein, we see Nikes and tripods in Iranian bronze coinage he mints probably immediately before his death in the Eastern campaign. Interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah.
I see no other hand raised, so I can at least throw 2 notes into the round. The one thing is that you seem to be believing that the foundation of the polis of Babylon dates to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. This is controversial, and the Nancy team, which has a strong focus on Babylon, has recently argued, based on an epigraphic fragment, that we should actually date the beginning to Antiochus III. And I found it very convincing. Letitia Glassner-Tomé drove my attention to this chapter, which is also in the book that she co-authored with Philippe Clancier. And I was convinced that it's as early, but Nick Secunda, also in his recent article, or in his forthcoming, or just having forthcoming article, has tried to reinforce the younger or lower chronology, because he is firmly committed to the idea of a major army reform under Antiochus IV. I think in your reconstruction, because it does not actually hurt that much, because your emphasis is on after Magnesia, and so it would be compatible with either view. So that's the one point. And I'm looking into the round because I've forgotten the other. Yes, please. Mario, you want to? No. Well, then I would say we end this round with thanking Paul once again for his exciting presentation, and also for coming all the way from Alabama to join us here in Utrecht. Thank you so much for this opportunity.